All right, good afternoon, everybody. We're gonna start here, and I wanna say welcome, and I wanna say right in front here that my tone is gonna be a little bit different than it sometimes is when I have the chance to talk with you guys. Our purpose today is a really serious one. We're here intentionally outside in this spot for a really important reason. Our goal is to commemorate or remember a really terrible, life-altering day in American history, to learn about the life of one of our alums, Andrew King from the class of 1977, and to reflect a little bit on our individual and collective responsibility to create the world as we want it to be. On 9/11/2001, 20 years ago tomorrow, a coordinated attack happened on our soil, with the attackers hijacking a series of planes and crashing them in various places, into the Pentagon, into the World Trade Center buildings, into a field in rural Pennsylvania. In each of those cases, lives were senselessly ended. Young lives, older lives, all ages in between. Every person, every one of them, a friend, a family member, a loved one, a colleague, an important individual with life left to live and contributions left to make. Our world was less through their loss. It was a terrible day, whether you were connected to it or to someone, no matter where you lived. The effects of those events and the days immediately following echoed loudly and continue to ring in our ears today. But in a strange way, it was also an event that carried with it the potential to unite everyone who believes in peaceful resolution to problems. People from different political parties, religious traditions, ideological backgrounds, and places in the world were brought together in a condemnation of violence and hatred and needless bloodshed. The 20 years that have passed have seen our world lose that unity. But I would ask that we, as a community, even amongst that division, put those divisions aside for this moment, in this place, to believe once again in peace and unity, and to see ourselves as having a role in achieving the noble goal of a world that is better for everyone. Many of you were not alive on that day and know it only from horrifying video clips, documentaries, and other mechanisms. None of us who was alive that day will ever forget it. All of us were participants in history. We each have memories of that day, and it is the nature of history that those moments will be at once similar and different. You all know what perspective is. You talk about it in your classes. Your place in life, your point of view, where you live, all matter. So I'm very appreciative that two faculty members have offered to share with us today their memories of that day. Mr. Rafferty and Ms. Cooper-Mullen are going to come forward and talk with us about their memories. I am so appreciative of their willingness to do that. We are going to begin with Mr. Rafferty, and I would invite him to the podium.
On September 11, 2001, I had recently graduated from college and had just started working for a publishing company, Pearson Education, in Boston. It was my first time in the real world, as they say, starting my first corporate job and living in a house with 4 other recent college graduates. On that morning, sometime between 9 and 10 a.m., at least I think, I received a panicked phone call from my mother at my desk, and she told me to look at the news. I immediately went to a news website on my computer and saw images of the first plane hitting the tower. I went into my boss's office to inform her of what was happening. She was also watching the images on her computer, and within a short period of time, everyone at my work was sent home. I promptly got on the subway and headed to my house in Somerville, Massachusetts. While not nearly as bad as New York City or Washington, D.C., Boston was a mess with emergency vehicles and personnel. It would remain that way for many weeks after. I continued to speak with my parents throughout the day. My brother was getting his PhD at Columbia in New York City at this time, and his side job was giving tours of Manhattan, which often included a route around the Twin Towers. Cell phone service was problematic given the situation, and no one was able to get in touch with them. We were growing very concerned. I spent much of that day awaiting contact with my brother and repeatedly watching images of the devastation with my housemates on the TV in our living room, expecting to hear the worst about my brother. By the evening, I was able to get in contact with my brother and was deeply relieved to know that he was okay. My family was extremely lucky that he was all right. Many thousands of others were not. My brother and I had a lengthy conversation about what happened, and while I don't remember all of the details, he made some predictions about how this is going to change life for us in the U.S. Everything he said was accurate, especially how strict security restrictions would be placed on air travel. A deep fear set in the days and weeks after the event. We learned that several of the hijackers had stayed at a hotel that was down the street from my office in Boston. It became routine to see FBI agents and other officials in hazmat suits investigating this area. While all Americans grew fearful during these times, those of us who resided in cities had a unique kind of paranoia set in. Every time a subway train or an elevator I was on would stop unexpectedly, I would think to myself, this is it. This is the end. This fear became part of our daily lives. While I feared for myself, I also grew deeply concerned for my Muslim friends from high school, who I knew could be subjected to a racist backlash. To my knowledge, that did not happen to anyone I was close with, but there were numerous reports of Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus being subjected to violence because of their beliefs and the color of their skin. Unfortunately, this event deeply contributed to some very ugly prejudice and racism directed at those of Middle Eastern descent. The U.S. obviously still wrestles with this shameful reaction to this day. Several months after September 11th, I was visiting my girlfriend at the time in New London, Connecticut. We went for a walk around her neighborhood. She pointed out an empty house to me where a family had once lived. All of them had perished on 9/11. I wondered how many other homes were missing a father, a mother, a brother, sister, son, or daughter as a result of that traumatic day. For those of us who came of age in the 90s, we finally got to experience a brief time in modern history that was free from a constant existential foreign threat. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we knew something that no American had had since before World War II, a true feeling of national peace. On September 11, 2001, that feeling was completely shattered. In one way or another, America has been at war ever since, physically and ideologically. Reminders of this tragic day could be found in virtually all walks of American life, from the ubiquitous American flags displayed everywhere to the Never Forget t-shirts and memorial signs. But what really stood out to me was seeing National Guardsmen and women stationed at bus terminals with brandished assault rifles. Years later, when I lived in New Jersey, I would see them at Port Authority every time I visited a friend in New York City. This was not a common sight before 2001, but has become something we expect to see now in all major travel centers. The sight of U.S. soldiers on guard in public places will forever remind me of that day and how much all of our lives were forever changed.
September 11th, 2001, I was in 8th grade, and it was picture day. I went to a small private school, similar to this one, in Westchester, New York. Which, if you don't know about the East Coast, is a county just north of New York City on the Hudson River. Everyone in my neighborhood had a parent, if not two parents, who worked in Manhattan, many of whom worked in the financial industry, which was headquartered downtown. I was at school, I was 12, and we were called to our homerooms, pretty similar to advisory, and told that something had happened. They didn't show us any images, and that we would be kept in our homerooms for the rest of the day. My homeroom was a computer classroom, and so immediately every single kid in the room hopped on an old boxy Apple computer and tried to figure out what was going on. Within minutes, we saw images of the plane flying into the first tower, and a feeling of absolute dread set in for 17, 12-year-olds, all of whom had a parent who worked in downtown Manhattan. My school made the decision to keep us separate from other classes with the knowledge that almost every single person on campus was, as Mr. Rafferty mentioned, worried about a loved one in New York City. And my enduring memory of the day is that they chose to not send us home. Part of that has to do with school procedures around disasters that I don't know. What I do know is that my elder sister was a junior in high school, and she drove us to school every day. And she broke me out of my computer classroom. She actually told a teacher that we were leaving and no one could stop us. When I got home, my mom and my two other sisters were waiting at home, and no one had heard from my father. It turns out that that day, because of what had happened at the World Trade Center, New York City subways had stopped running, and so had local methods of transportation, and all of the bridges into Manhattan were closed. My dad came home around 1 o'clock in the morning the next day because he'd bought a bike off a guy on the street and had biked home the 35 miles to our house. The next day, we learned that my godfather had died on the plane that flew into the Pentagon. One of the things that happened in the weeks that followed September 11th was both a feeling of incredible community and grief, but also a profound sense that nothing in our lives would ever be the same. And it wasn't. It's hard possibly for you to understand that, given that you weren't alive. You don't remember that we used to be able to walk up to a plane and greet the people coming off it on the tarmac. It's not a reality for any of you anymore, but it was for us. Many other things, including a sense of safety, were a reality, and they were taken away. I remember in high school, a year after September 11th, there was a threat made on a nuclear power plant that was not too far from my house. And as a result, my mom encouraged me, my siblings, and all of our friends to start carrying packets of iodine pills in the off chance that there was a radioactive nuclear attack near our home. These are the types of things that we all lived through. And in some ways, that makes our experience unique, being from New York and having that particular sense of fear and loss. But in another way, as you may be starting to understand, my experience was not unique. It was felt by most people in most places around the world. And in some ways, when Mr. Hanford asked if anyone wanted to share with you today, I volunteered because I was just about the same age that you were, and I remember feeling just as scared and dismayed as you might have felt when you learned that your schools were shutting down a year ago and you didn't know when you would see your friends or families again. Luckily, the past years have shown us that we have the capacity for human connection and kindness. And I would just encourage you to consider that we are all living through momentous occasions each day. And this one might feel really far away for each of you, and maybe it's a little weird to hear stories from a bunch of older people telling you about our feelings. But in fact, so many of us were shaped by these experiences, and your lives have been shaped by them as well, even though you weren't there for it. Think about it. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you for those heartfelt, really important reflections. We're meeting here in this spot, as some of you may know, because the beautiful garden behind us is dedicated to an Elgin Academy alum, Andrew King, from the class of 1977. I wanted to make sure that as we reflect on this event, we also ground ourselves in this spot and remember that this event, a moment of history for you, happened to very normal people like all of us. Elgin Academy, with its long storied history, was tragically affected that day as well, as were so many far-flung places, big and small, all over the world. Andrew King was 42 years old, a trader for a firm called Cantor Fitzgerald in New York. He had a wife and 3 children, 2 of whom were your age. His family will spend tomorrow together playing golf, the game that Andrew loved and where he was most himself. At Elgin Academy, AK, as he was called by all who knew him, was a great friend, the one to whom others turned, an athlete who was skilled and competitive, and a fantastic teammate. He went on from here to graduate from the University of North Carolina, where he enjoyed watching his fellow UNC Tar Heel Michael Jordan. Some of you may have heard of him. And Andy also, after graduating from college, lived in Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York at various points before he settled with his family in Princeton, New Jersey. He loved his family. He loved to golf with anyone who would play, especially his father and brother and his closest friends on the world's great courses. He gave of himself to others and knew that connections anywhere, at home, on the golf course, at work, friend to friend, were the most important things in the world. When he tragically passed away, some of his classmates rallied in the midst of all of their grief in an effort to help us make this garden behind me a reality. Not only did they help fund the beautiful spot, but they also gathered in his honor to dig the garden and plant this garden. And the result is this beautiful tribute you see behind me. At a celebration a few years later, a good friend, Sean Purcell, an EA classmate, remembered Andy saying, AK was my best friend. He was bold and charismatic, full of energy and spirit, possessed of great wit and charm. And he also commented that his memory would, quote, help us have courage in the face of bigger foes, believe in ourselves, and know the meaning of friendship and love and honor. As we consider this life lost too young, and think in our hearts about his family and all affected by his loss, we also must acknowledge that that tragic day resulted in thousands of stories of loss, just like Andy's and just like the ones you heard. I'd like to call forward Brianna Sushita to read a quote from a ceremony like this one, held in 2019. This quote is from an unknown source, but so eloquently captures the magnitude of this loss and the importance of living life minute to minute.
On this day,
September 10th, 19 years ago, now 20 years ago today, 246 people went to sleep in preparation for their morning flights. 2,608 people went to sleep in preparation for work in the morning. 343 firefighters went to sleep in preparation for their morning shift. 60 police officers went to sleep in preparation for their morning patrols. 8 paramedics went to sleep in preparation for their morning shift. None of them saw past 10 a.m. September 11th, 2001. In one single moment, life may never be the same. As you live and enjoy the breaths you take today and tonight, before you go to sleep in preparation for your life tomorrow, kiss the one you love, snuggle a little tighter, and never take 1 second for granted.
Thank you, Brianna. As we resolve not to let Andy's memory be wasted and to acknowledge our roles in bringing about peace, I'd like to call forward Olivia Welch to read a poem about peace that was shared at the International Day of Peace in 2011, 10 years after the tragic event. This message is a very important one for all of us to consider. Olivia.
Let light fill the sky, let its warmth heal us, wherever we are broken. Let it burn away the fog, so that we can see each other clearly. Let our selfishness vanish, so we can see all people as our neighbors, as a part of our family. Let the flames teach our hearts to reach always upward toward heaven. Our world awaits the light that each of us can bring. Let the water wash away the ancient grudges, the bitter hatred nurtured over generations. May it melt the memory of our own pain. Let our hearts nourished by the water of life blossom in beauty. Our world awaits the water that each of us can bring.
Thank you. As we conclude our time together, I want to thank you for understanding the gravity of why we're here. And I want to ask us to do something really, really hard, because moments like this call for that. Remembering somebody's legacy calls for that. And remembering a historic moment like this calls for that. I'd like to ask each of us to, for just a minute, close our eyes and think in the silence of our own hearts about what our role, our individual role, can be in bringing about a more peaceful world. I understand that that may mean very different things to different people, but that's the beauty of reflection. I would ask that we all be silent for just a moment and reflect on what we have heard today. Thank you. Thank you for participating in this with us this afternoon. If you would like to spend a moment, I would encourage you at some point in this spot where you are frequently on our campus, that you take a moment to reflect on the plaque and reflect on Andy's life. But I think what he would want me to say, and I did not know Andy, but in everything that I've read about him, I think what he would want me to say to you is that when you walk by here on your way to the gym to compete, when you're out here with your friends, playing, spending time, when you're doing anything, think about the importance of that moment. Think of the importance of those around you, and think about the importance of all of those relationships. Whether it's the relationships you form competing there, whether it's the relationship you form in your classes, whether it's the relationship you form in all of the ways in which you form them. To understand how important they are and how they knit the fabric together. So thank you very much for your participation in this. And I would, if you would like to spend a moment, that's fine. And then we are finished here. So thank you. Have a good afternoon.